So let's get going with spring adaptation. Endobiogeny studies all levels of life, from the subatomic, the quantum, the molecular, DNA, cellular structure, tissue structure, organs, all the systems, and ultimately how we interact with the universe around us. How can we make such a claim? Well, because we have a pineal gland, a third eye, an eye which sees light, which perceives light through the two physical eyes. And the fact that we live on a planet which rotates around an axis creates a day and night phenomenon which changes the duration of light and darkness. And the fact that our planet revolves around a star, its sun, and it's tilted on its axis, we have seasons. So every living organism on this earth has to constantly adapt itself to day and night and to the seasons and the changing durations of day and night and the changing of temperature. So the harmonization of the rhythmicity of life depends on the pineal gland. And through melatonin and pro-opiomelanocortin, we have the production of the two melanocyte stimulating hormones, beta and alpha. And alpha MSH, which you'll learn in the course, is more closely associated with general adaptation and dealing with things like stressors, surgery, car accidents, etc. But beta MSH is going to be implicated in seasonal adaptability and how it affects the functioning of the thyroid and the adrenal cortex. And both of these MSHs are implicated in nocturnal endocrinology. So in general, rhythms and the rhythmicity of life is key to understanding how life functions and how to reduce the incidence of disorders of rhythmicity. With this concept of cosmobiology, we can expand the notion of terrain. So we have the genotype as the foundation of the encoded messages and actions of life that are expressed as a phenotype. And then we have what we talked about in the first hour, which is the triad of the endocrine system, the autonomic nervous system, the emunctories to manage metabolism and the metabolic capabilities that are expressed through our phenotypic reality. And of course, we have the important roles of the immune system, various organs, and lymphatics. And then we have this concept of autopathogenicity, which you'll learn about in the Science of Endobiogeny course. Autopathogenicity, very briefly, would be the genetic polymorphisms which cause people to have some weakness in their adaptation to certain types of responses and which lay the foundation for major disorders in their life. And then we have the chronobiology, and we have the overlay of the central nervous system, and more broadly, the concept of mind. And then this entire meta unit of terrain, which is the organism, is constantly interfacing with an external environment, which includes pollutants and other factors which cause epigenetic modification to our genotype and the actual achieved phenotypic expression. We have historically maternal-fetal interactions, which also affect the epigenetics. We have the choices that we make in our rhythmic living or the dysrhythmic living and how we engage with the external environment. Do we stay up past midnight? Do we go on benders, drinking a lot of alcohol and partying until late at night? Do we get up too early for our body and force ourselves to stay awake? etc.? Do we not take a nap when we feel tired? These are all choices we make oftentimes in dysrhythmic living. Sometimes there are imposed choices because we have to work a night shift. We all have done that at some point as doctors. Then there's seasonality. There's the effects of cosmic rays. For example, the electromagnetic, our body has an electromagnetic component. Of course, we know that that's how CT scans are working and how EEGs and ECGs are working is because we have this electrical function. And for example, the electromagnetic emanations from the sun are so powerful, they've been known to disrupt satellites or power stations on the Earth, and they affect geomagnetic activity, which affect us, which I'll demonstrate. And then, of course, we have the microbiome, which is an external cluster of living organisms which live within us. So they're not endogenous, but without them, we wouldn't be. And they're, of course, also affected by the external environment and the food we eat and how our food choices affect the microbiome, etc. There's also weather and geomagnetic issues. So it's in the context of all of this that we come to the question of how exactly do human beings adapt to spring and what is there even to adapt to or adapt for? And we have diet. So I'm going to present to you now an animation which demonstrates three different factors: geomagnetic output from the earth, adrenal gland, cortex activity, and thyroid activity. Now, the adrenal and thyroid lines are conceptual because there's no units. But the geomagnetic activity I'll show you is in picoteslas, and these are real measurements that were made using a magnetometer over more than several years of measurements, actually, in the Baltics. So we have here, we're going to start in spring. We have this period of pre-summer adaptation. We have summer, we have pre-autumn adaptation, we have autumn, we have pre-winter adaptation, we have winter, and then we have pre-spring. So in green, we have geomagnetic activity. From a few days before the beginning of the vernal equinox, the first day of spring, we start to see, or it's just after that, we see that geomagnetic activity starts to rise. And adrenal activity is at a baseline level, and thyroid activity is declining. So what I want to show you is a particular pattern which exists except in pre-spring, which is that thyroid and geomagnetic activity tend to be inverse to each other. Because the more that we're nourished with the geomagnetic output from the earth, the less we need thyroid activity on average, because we're receiving this external energy to help power our systems. So what happens in the adaptation to summer? There's a natural rise on average in geomagnetic output. And to help the organism adapt to summer, there's a brief rise in adrenal activity, which then significantly falls. And the same thing is true of thyroid activity, because remember, for most of the year, it works inversely to geomagnetic output. Now, during this time of summer, we have the peak of geomagnetic activity, and we have the lowest need for adrenal and thyroid activity because we have such a strong level of geomagnetic activity to help modify the magnetic and electromagnetic functioning of our body and how that affects our metabolism. But what happens as the days become shorter again, and there is a demand to prepare for autumn? There's a pre-autumn adaptation. We see the geomagnetic activity in green starts to decline. And as always during these intermediate periods, you see a boost, a rise in adrenal function, ideally. as this helps prepare the organism for the change in the level of metabolism. And you see again that there's a commensurate rise in thyroid activity here at the bottom of the screen, which is inversely related to the gentle decline here in geomagnetic activity. And then we have the autumn time, and the geomagnetic activity starts to fall more precipitously. And the adrenals, which have substantially increased their level from summer, now should be equilibrated and functioning at a generally higher level than you would see in the spring. And again, we see a commensurate rise in thyroid activity in response to the geomagnetic fall. And now we have the need to adapt the organism for winter. And geomagnetic activity continues to fall. And once again, we see a rise in adrenal cortex activity, which then levels off. And as you might suspect, there is a commensurate rise in thyroid activity. So now, as we're entering into the dark days of winter, this is all for the Northern Hemisphere, of course. We are at a point where the dependence on the thyroid activity is exceeding the geomagnetic. And adrenal and thyroid activity are functioning pretty much at their highest as a concerted group of activity, as you see here. They're at their peak because geomagnetic function is at its nadir, and the exposure to light is at its nadir, and the exposure to darkness is at its zenith. But now we're going to come to this special situation of the pre-spring adaptation, which actually began just a few days ago, which makes this a very relevant topic. Everything I just said pretty much goes out the window. So you see how there's a rise of geomagnetic activity on average from now until springtime. While we do have this adrenal adaptation, what happens to thyroid is really the issue here. Because you see here, we have a drop in thyroid activity while adrenal is rising. So that's different. Because in all these other times, like here, you see in the pre-autumn and the pre-winter, with each of these boosts, there was some type of relative increase in thyroid activity, but not here. And look at their gap. And now you see what happens is you have this one period of time right here where thyroid activity is increasing, and so is geomagnetic. So let's start to look again at the normal physiology of adaptation before we come to understand these disadapted states. So we can talk about two subphases. Okay, we're going to talk about this phase here, and we're going to talk about this phase here. So here's a close-up of what I showed you. Here's February 18th. That was a few days ago. Okay, we have this boost of adrenal activity and a drop in thyroid activity while geomagnetic activity is increasing. So in subphase one, we have an inverted adrenal thyroid relationship, as I mentioned. One is rising, the adrenals, the other is falling. So cortisol rises in particular. Why? Because it's increasing catabolism and allows for the release of accumulated toxins, most of which were stored in fat cells during the winter. There should be a slight decrease in the anabolic steroids in the adrenal cortex, and this allows catabolism to predominate. And you see this drop in thyroid functioning, which avoids over catabolizing. Because if you had a rise in cortisol and a rise in thyroid hormones at the same time, you would go into too intense catabolic state here. That would not be helpful, because then you'd start to catabolize muscle rather than fat, for example. And it's also to prevent a metabolic strain on cells, because the major sink or recipient of thyroid hormone activity should be within the emunctories, like the liver and the kidney and the intestines, in order to process the toxins that are being released from the body. And when I say toxins, I'm not only referring to exogenous toxins from the environment, but also endogenously produced toxins just from metabolism. Now, in subphase 2, we're dealing with this point here. And again, we're just talking about physiology, not pathophysiology. Remember, what's happening is we have a special case of thyromagnetic predominance because you have rising thyroid and rising geomagnetic during this brief peak, and you have this fall in adrenal activity. So again, it's the only time that thyroid and geomagnetic activity increase together, and the only time that thyroid predominates over the adrenals. So those of you who've studied endobiology will know that there's an index called metabolic yield, which is looking at, it's modeling the average rate of metabolism throughout the body. And there should be a surge in the metabolic yield at this point with maximal ATP production for emunctory drainage and detoxification. So now let's look at something like spring hypoadaptation, where there's not enough of adrenal function. This is going to put people at risk of retaining these toxins that have accumulated or retoxifying certain organs as one organ releases toxins, but the liver or kidneys, for example, cannot accommodate them. And so maybe these toxins now get deposited in the joints or they get deposited in the lungs or in the brain. And other tendencies you might see are a certain type of allergies that's more eosinophilic in nature, a wet bronchitis, depression. So I'm going to speed through this part so we can focus on where the pathophysiology is in this case. Okay. So now we're going to pay attention here between these two gray lines. So the geomagnetic activity goes on like it normally does. And so does the thyroid, okay? It has the drop, it has the peak, and then it goes down again, opposite to geomagnetic, which is how it functions the rest of the year. But let's see what happens to the adrenals. Okay, we're going to focus on this green box. The dotted line represents what should have happened. Okay, this is physiologic. We would have expected this bump up and then a drop. But instead, we see this. We see a drop in adrenal activity that slightly recovers. Okay, so we don't have this ability to start to mobilize the toxins. So here's a close-up of what we just looked at. Again, this would be physiologic, the dotted line. This is what's actually happening. So if you did a GEMMA allergy panel right now, you can order a CBC, or maybe you already did for your patient. It'll come back in a day. Just run the panel and see what it is. If your patient has a history of allergies, it'll probably say that there's a global allergic risk that's present and you need to validate it clinically. Let's say your patient has not started to show signs of allergies, but their eosinophil to monocyte ratio is high and the allergic risk is there and their histamines are elevated. That means that they probably don't have hepatobiliary congestion yet, excuse me. And you have a chance to focus a simple treatment on liver gallbladder drainage. And you can also improve cortisol activity. Those of you who've studied with us, or just as a quick refresher, spasmophilia is this dysfunction in the transition from para to alpha to beta sympathetic. And you would expect to see or could anticipate some spasmophilia where you'd want to use something like hawthorn or German chamomile. And there could be some indications of hepatosplenic congestion, and there'd be some different plants you'd want to consider. So let's actually look at a panel so we can take this theoretical approach and apply it. So here's the patient. Isn't it incredible? Their name happens to be I love endobiogeny. But here's a 33-year-old female. And in the allergy panel, you see in section 1, which is the results, that their global allergy risk for acute allergies is 33, so it's already elevated. And their histamines are quite elevated, over 400. And they have a lymphocytic predominance, and they have an eosinophilic predominance, which you would expect in a classical allergic pattern. Now, if your patient already has allergies, you can start treating them. But let's say in the face of these results, they actually are not showing signs of allergies yet. Well, it says right here, if the patient is asymptomatic, they're at risk of allergic flare when exposed to allergens in the context of hepatobiliary congestion. So if they're not allergic yet, they're either not exposed to their environmental allergens, for example, like maybe it's a plant which blossoms uh, in April or May and not in February or March. Or they haven't developed hepatobiliary congestion yet. So again, you have this chance to treat them. So for each of these results, there's an interpretation that's specific to this result and this level of result to explain what's going on. And then in the next page, you would see this treatment section, which gives you a summary recommendation of your overall therapeutic strategy, a complete low histamine diet, and I'll show you that because we have a handout included for free in this panel. And I've highlighted in the same color a couple of treatments that repeatedly come up. Rhodiola comes up 3 times. Blackcurrant as a chemotherapy comes up twice. Burdock, the wild pansy, which we talked about earlier. You could consider birch, vitamin C, quercetin, thyme essential oil. That actually came up twice. I didn't highlight it here. So you can create a pretty simple treatment that is really polyvalent and going across the system. Here's the handout that you can give to your patient to save you time on a low histamine diet. It talks both about foods you want to encourage them to eat, as well as foods to avoid. And there's 3 levels: foods that are rich in histamine, foods that block the diamine oxidase and slow down breakdown of histamine, and foods that trigger histamine release. Okay, so you can also have a spring hyperadaptation. So let's go through this animation quickly again. And let's come to this time. Okay, so we're focusing here on the right side and inside this green box. So in this situation, the adrenals respond perfectly appropriately, as you would expect. This is how thyroid should function in the dotted line, but this is what happens. So let's talk about this. There was an under response from the thyroid initially. And the compensatory adaptation by the hypothalamic and pituitary thyroid trophins, TRH or TSH, overstimulated the thyroid. Okay? So now you have this over response. And let's see what happens here. You could look at a thyroid functional level. So again, how would you know which panels? Because you need to know your patient's history. There's a certain type of allergies with a more of a monocytic predominance, and I'll talk about that. They could have psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis, eczema, various autoimmune conditions that flare up at this time of the year, because a lot of these are implicating the thyroid system. You could order a thyroid functional level 2 panel. This is TSH, free T3, free T4, LDH, and creatine kinase. And you might see something like overactive central thyroid kinetics with a free T3 excess. And if you went through the panel, maybe you'd see that your T4, T3 ratio is low. And you might want to use chase tree to slow down the rate of conversion of T4 to T3. And your thyroid index is on the higher end of normal. And your thyroid yield is high, which means even though the functional activity of thyroid hormones at the level of the tissue is in the normal range, the thyroid responds too quickly every time TRH or TSH stimulates it. And so if, let's say, thyroid needs to be increased at a certain time of the day by 10 units, it's increased by 17 units. That's what thyroid yield is saying. The spurts and the peaks of thyroid activity are too exaggerated. So you might want to use something like motherwort and stone seed. You could use lithy tree as a gemotherapy. You could use peachy, which is Fabiana and Bricata. You could also, again, just stick to the allergy panel if you're really not sure or you just had a CBC. And while the allergy panel would be the indication of allergic risk would be present, it would be because the monocyte to neutrophil ratio is high, in which case glutathione would be indicated. And of course, you could use Pansy or Burdock plus or minus quercetin. So again, how do you know when to use glutathione? How do you know when to use rhodiola or this or that? The panel will rationally recommend some proposals to you to consider. Well, this concluded really this brief introduction to spring adaptation, and I hope you have some very practical things that you know that you can do. Find these patients with a history of psoriatic arthritis, of psoriasis, of autoimmune flare-ups, of allergies that occur sometime between now and May. You just start with an allergy panel with the CBC. You can add an adrenal panel. You can add a spasophilia panel. With that same CBC, you can order multiple panels and start to get a really deep level of understanding. And you can start to use these various interventions that come up specifically for your patient's needs. So in summary to this section, the earth and all organisms on it have an internal rhythm that adapts to the external rhythms generated by the earth's revolution around its tilted axis and its rotation around the sun. The interplay of geomagnetic and hormonal factors allows for regulation of metabolism in the face of these changes. And disruption of this interplay during the pre-spring period of adaptation can result in under or over adaptation and various disorders. So in the susceptible terrain, again, even if you have these changes, if the emunctories are not congested, the patient may not end up expressing these disorders, or they might have a milder case. But in the susceptible terrain, disadaptation favors various disorders. Okay, so this